Welcome to Mission Evolution Radio Show with Gwilda Wiyaka, bringing together today's leading experts to uncover ever-deepening spiritual truths and the latest scientific developments in support of the evolution of humankind. For more information on Mission Evolution Radio with Gwilda Wiyaka, visit www.missionevolution.org. And now, here's the host of Mission Evolution, Miss Gwilda Wiyaka.
What are the true effects of glyphosate and genetically modified foods? What are they doing to our health and to that of the planet? Is there any escape from them? Mission Evolution Radio Show is coming to you around the world on the X-Zone TV channel, xztv.ca. With us this hour to take a closer look at GMOs and glyphosates is Jeffery M. Smith. Jeffery is the founder and executive director of IRT, the author of Seeds of Deception, and award-winning filmmaker. As a global thought leader on the health dangers of genetically modified organisms, for over 27 years, he's authored 2 bestsellers, directed 5 documentaries, delivered 2,000 lectures and interviews in 45 countries, trained 1,500 speakers, and organized more than 10,000 grassroots advocates. Jeffery has counseled world leaders in 6 continents, and his meticulous research presented at medical conferences inspired thousands to prescribe non-GMO and organic diets. His website, responsibletechnology.org. Jeffery, thank you so much for joining us on Mission Evolution.
My pleasure, Gwilda.
So this is a hot topic. We've been living with GMOs and glyphosates for quite some time. How did you first become interested in them?
Well, in 1996, I went to a lecture by someone who was kind of blowing the whistle on genetic engineering as a genetic engineer. At the time, we did not know much about it, meaning the population, and yet Monsanto Company was about to introduce genetically engineered soy and corn into our food supply that year. And they were doing a technology that had never been applied to our food supply. This particular scientist said he knew from his own work that genetic engineering is prone to side effects. And there was no way that Monsanto or anyone could guarantee that the foods created by genetic engineering would actually be safe. Moreover, once they're put into the environment, they'll cross-pollinate, self-propagate, and be part of our gene pool for as long as those species existed. So it was talking about a technology to change the nature of nature and potentially endanger the health of all of us. And yet there was basically no required safety studies by the United States government. So this basically was an alarm that went off in my head. And I said, we need to do something. So I decided to help out a little. And here I am, 29 years later, still working on it.
So what have we discovered in those 29 years? Did the prophecy come true that the scientist was saying?
Unfortunately, yes. I'm looking at lots of evidence that many of the major and even minor diseases that have been rising since the late 90s have done so likely because of the introduction of GMOs and the Roundup or glyphosate toxins that are sprayed on most of them. We have a lot of evidence showing that the rise in the diseases are rising in parallel with the increased use of GMOs. We have animal feeding studies showing that these same diseases or their precursors show up in animals that are force-fed Roundup or GMOs. We have identified the biochemical causative pathways linking the GMOs and glyphosate to the diseases. And we also have thousands of people and physicians saying that when people stop eating GMOs and stop exposing themselves to Roundup, they get better from many of these same diseases. So the package we're looking at suggests that switching to an organic diet may be one of the most fundamental and critical pieces that someone can do to prevent disease or recover.
That's pretty scary. So let's talk, what exactly are GMOs? I mean, we all hear of them, but what exactly are they?
GMOs involve changing the genetic code so you can insert genetic material from another species or edit and rearrange the genes within a species. Typically, for years, it was done with a gene gun, blasting millions of genes into a plate of cells, hoping that some would make it their way into the DNA and then express a particular trait that the scientists wanted. Now there's tools like CRISPR that are more precise in terms of where they target, but both methods cause massive collateral damage. In fact, 3 studies on CRISPR, which has been touted by the industry as a revelation, 3 studies were analyzed by Nature, the journal Nature, and described as chromosomal mayhem. There were massive deletions, additions, rearrangements, and mutations. And unfortunately, these are being overlooked by many of the proponents of this technology that are already using it to create foods and new animals and new products to be released into the environment.
I didn't realize they're actually using it to create new animals as well. Has that been successful?
Well, I'll give you an example. Years ago, they used a gene editing technique to silence the gene that created the horns for cattle. They wanted to create hornless cattle so that they can be put together in CAFOs in the factory farm so they wouldn't hurt each other, or they wouldn't have to saw off the horns. And they claimed that the results of the genetic engineering was so successful and so perfect. Advocates say this proves we don't have to do any safety testing for genetically engineered livestock. It just works. Now, 2.5 years later, someone at the FDA was given a software package that could analyze genetic information. And the person just happened to have all of the genetic information from this cow study that had been waved on with flying colors 2.5 years before. So she decided to put that data into the software just to see if it would work, and discovered that a mistake had been made and no one caught it. There were genes from bacteria that were used in the transfer process that were supposed to be eliminated that actually made it into the DNA of the cows. That meant that every cell of the cows and their offspring had bacterial DNA. And not only that, but the bacteria that had been incorporated was designed to create antibiotic resistance. So the theory was, if the cows were grown, and they were being grown in Brazil, made into herds for massive distribution, that the antibiotic resistance from the bacterial genes in their cells could potentially turn bacteria in them into antibiotic resistant diseases that would be exposed to the population. So the FDA scientists published the information. The embarrassed company withdrew their cows. The cows growing in Brazil were slaughtered. And it was an example of just one of many side effects that can occur with gene editing. In fact, on our site, responsibletechnology.org, we have an animated 6-minute video called 7 Reasons Why Gene Editing is Dangerous and Unpredictable. And this is one of them.
So, let's talk about glyphosate a little bit. What exactly is glyphosate?
Glyphosate was originally patented to clean industrial boilers and pipes because it's a descaler. It chelates or grabs onto minerals and strips them from the pipes and boilers. When the effluence was put on the ground, it killed all of the plants. And so the Monsanto company purchased the patent and purchased the molecule and patented it as an herbicide. Now, as an herbicide, it kills all of these plants, but Roundup ready crops have genes from bacteria inserted that allow them to survive in the presence of glyphosate. So glyphosate's the chief toxin in Roundup, Monsanto's herbicide, and glyphosate was very popular as a weed killer, but it was going off patent in 2000. And so Monsanto created Roundup ready crops and sold them to farmers in the late 90s, saying, if you buy our Roundup ready seeds, you have to use our version of glyphosate based herbicides even after they go off patent. And so Roundup ready crops, those that don't die when sprayed with Roundup, make it easier for farmers to weed their fields. They can weed by spraying over the already growing soybeans and corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, and alfalfa, even spray by plane, and it will kill the other plant biodiversity, the weeds, etc., but not the crops. Unfortunately, the glyphosate poison is brought into the crop, it's absorbed in, and it gets deposited into the fast growing portions, which is the part that we eat. So if you eat Roundup ready crops, soy, corn, cotton, canola, etc., then you end up getting a dose of the glyphosate, which is toxic. And it turns out, even though Monsanto claimed that glyphosate was safer than table salt and had no effect on human beings, it may in fact be one of the greatest causes of disease on the planet at this time. It's linked to a whole list of diseases, which we can go over.
That's kind of terrifying, isn't it? I understand you've done considerable research on GMOs and glyphosate. What did your research consist of, and where did you get the information?
I collaborated with dozens of scientists and doctors. I did surveys, I did analysis. Basically, I translated the science from many, many different sources into language that everyone could understand. Many of the scientists I talked to had very specific, narrow focuses. Some did animal feeding studies, some analyzed the faulty studies by the industry, others looked at biochemistry. I grabbed it all and put it into my book, Genetic Roulette, The Documented Risks of Genetically Engineered Foods, and also Seeds of Deception before that, and many, many articles. I also surveyed 3,156 people about which diseases or problems that they say they got better from when they switched to non-GMO and largely organic foods. And there were 28 different diseases that people reported getting better from, and substantially. The number one in the survey matched the same results I got by hand, people showing their hands at about 150 lectures, and that was digestive problems. 85% of the people reported that they got digestive problems improved or eliminated completely when they switched to organic or non-GMO diets. The next was fatigue, then obesity, brain fog, anxiety and depression, food allergies and sensitivity, and we're still above 50% of the people reporting improvements. Now, I can go through this whole list, but it turns out it's a very similar list to the health issues that have been rising in parallel with the increased use of GMOs and Roundup. So it tells you that the whole population is suffering from an increase of these disorders. And when people stop eating GMOs and Roundup, these disorders often become better or go away completely.
So it is not something that you can't turn around unless it gets going too far, I take it.
Well, obviously, it can certainly go too far. Some of the charts that we've correlated.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it looks like it's time for us to take another station break. Jeffrey and I will return very shortly, so please don't go away. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org.
The end has come, the night has fallen. I have reached the end of days. What's real is not, reason fails me.
What are they doing to our food and why? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. With us this hour discussing GMOs and glyphosates is the author of Seeds of Deceptions, Jeffery M. Smith. His website, responsibletechnology.org. Jeffrey, you were talking about how GMOs and glyphosates have gone up, and parallel with that has been illnesses, and a lot of it has to do with digestive issues. Do the GMOs and glyphosates compromise the friendly bacteria in our gut? Is that part of what the problem is here?
Excellent. Yes, it does. It's one of the several ways that digestion is damaged. But not only that, the microbiome or the bacterial and microorganism community inside human beings is critical for health. It can determine whether we're overweight or underweight, whether we have certain diseases. It can even dictate our moods and whether we're social people or not. It's amazing how much information is produced and programmed from these microbes. And there was a study that was published on the impact of Roundup on human gut bacteria. And they took human gut bacteria from a 3-year-old who was always eating organic and no vaccines and no antibiotics, and put that into a fake or a model of human gut, and then fed it food for a while and then fed it Roundup. And they noted dramatic changes in the microbiome. And when I went through those changes with one of the people that designed the study, I said, okay, here's 28 different diseases that people reported getting better from. Can these changes in the microbiome support these diseases? And so we did digestion, fatigue, obesity, brain fog, anxiety and depression, food allergies, memory, joint pain, seasonal allergies, gluten insensitivity or sensitivity, insomnia, hormones, muscle pain, autoimmune disease, eczema, blood pressure, asthma, menstrual problems, diabetes, cancer, kidney disease, etc. And each one, the scientists said, each one of them could be linked to the changes in the gut bacteria brought about by Roundup. So that shows one of the biochemical pathways that link Roundup or glyphosate with these diseases. Another one is leaky gut. Leaky gut was linked to essentially all diseases by a Harvard professor who wrote a study saying leaky gut is the cause of all diseases. Another one is mineral absorption or lack of mineral absorption. When the minerals are not available because glyphosate blocks the minerals, that also causes a widespread set of diseases. And another one is mitochondrial damage. The mitochondria are like the engines of the cells. They produce the energy, and the mitochondria is damaged also by glyphosate. So these 4 things are among the vectors for why this is such a disease-creating process, but by being absorbed by taking in glyphosate. Also, glyphosate blocks the detoxification processes of the liver and cells. So other toxins that we have in our bodies, which would normally be ushered out, may be stuck. And so I call glyphosate sort of the king of all toxins because it has a whole kingdom that it creates inside of us of toxins continuously damaging us.
So the microbiome, so that we understand this process, what does the microbiome do for us? What does it do that once it dies, we're in trouble?
Well, it has a major influence in our immune system. A significant part of our immune system are the gut bacteria and other microbes inside us. It produces certain vitamins. It's part of the protective wall of the gut. So detoxification, digestion, and immunity are key. Now, it's so important that when we have established a healthy microbiome as infants, we have a higher health outcome for the rest of our lives. Whereas if we have a poor microbiome, it means that our tendency to get sick will be higher for the rest of our lives. It's so important that the physiology has evolved a way to implant a healthy microbiome into infants. So in the second trimester of pregnancy, milk digesting bacteria come into the birth canal that inoculate the infant during the birthing process. The first milk from the mother helps eliminate the oxygen in the colon, so it prepares the way for bifidobacteria to survive, which is very healthy. Another 27 or 8% of the gut microbiome by the baby is produced by microbes from the milk, another 10% from the breast. And it's interesting that a good portion of the milk is not digestible by the baby. It's not even designed for the baby. It's designed to feed the microbiome. If the baby gets sick, the bacteria in their saliva feeds back through the breast during breastfeeding and changes the milk until the baby is better. It's an incredible process. If someone has breast cancer, a certain bacteria moves into the breast to contain it. If someone has problems with the brain, a certain fungus moves into the brain. We've outsourced about 90% of our daily metabolic and chemical functions to the microbiome, and now we rely on it to survive. It's like we're a community. We have more microbes in our body than we have cells.
Well, I find it very, very interesting what you were saying about the baby. So if we have a C-section and feed with formula, then that child doesn't have the microbiome they need?
Exactly. So there is a suggestion, and you can look it up. I'm not an expert at this, but I've talked to pediatricians about it. If someone has a C-section, there's a way to swab the birth canal and then put the bacteria on the orifice of the face, et cetera, of the child to help create that healthy microbiome. And that it's very important, if possible, to breastfeed, especially at the beginning of the child's life, because there's a number of not only biological transference, but also things like colostrum, et cetera.
So we have an entire society or entire generation of people that Dr. Spock got a hold of, right?
Yep.
And that weren't breastfed. And then add to that the GMOs and the glyphosates that we're dealing with now. What's happening to that generation as a result?
Unfortunately, the amount of chronic disease we're facing is through the roof. Now, there's a lot of finger pointing as to what might be causing that. And my research shows that a significant contributor is glyphosate and GMOs. So I also think that, the breastfeeding, the lack of breastfeeding and the C-sections, et cetera, create a vulnerability, but we still have these toxins available in the environment that can exploit the vulnerability of these systems that have been damaged because of the lack of natural birth or breast milk.
And I take it from what you said earlier that it's not something you can just wash off.
No, unfortunately, there is another chemical that's added to Roundup that drives the glyphosate into the plant so that it becomes systemic. And that's why if you deal with glyphosate, with Roundup, it drives it into the skin as well. In fact, it absorbs so much into the skin that when Monsanto scientists, and this came out during a trial where Monsanto was being sued for causing the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma of the plaintiff, the person described that they took Roundup and applied it to human cadaver skin to see how much was absorbed. And the person reported about 10%, which was about 3.3 times the allowable limit by the EPA. So instead of reporting that to the EPA, they took new cadaver skin and first cooked it in an oven and then froze it, and then applied the Roundup to this leather-like human skin and had very little absorption. And that's what they reported to the EPA without telling the agency that they had first cooked and frozen the human skin. So this, unfortunately, is the way that Monsanto, I believe, normally cooks their books, because I have actually studied their research and talked with numerous scientists who have written extensively about this type of research, which is more corporate science rather than actual science.
So if these products are so dangerous, why are they allowed on the market?
That's also traced back to the corporate influence of companies like Monsanto. It was their former attorney, Michael Taylor, who was put in charge of policy at the FDA back in the late 90s. The White House had told the FDA to promote GMOs and suggested, we were told, that Michael Taylor be in charge. So he had already worked with Monsanto and a consortium of biotech companies to come up with a regulatory framework that would allow GMOs to be quickly put on the market without much safety testing or any safety testing. And so then he was given a position in the FDA to make it actual policy. The policy that he authored claimed that the agency was not aware of any information showing that GMOs were different, and therefore no labeling or safety testing was necessary. Companies like Monsanto could determine if their foods were safe. He then became Monsanto's vice president. Years later, documents made public from a lawsuit showed that the statement in the policy was not true, the overwhelming consensus among the scientists working at the agency, in fact, the committee that was tasked to recommend GMO policy, had consistently said that GMOs could create allergens, toxins, and new diseases. It was prone to side effects, and that studies were needed, including human toxicological studies. All of this was rejected. The existence of these concerns were denied, and the statement in the policy was exactly the opposite as what was actually happening in the agency by the scientists.
So
Now,
I'm
yes.
sorry, what steps are being taken at this point to expose this so that we can get this stuff off the market?
Well, I've done what I've helped build a movement around the world to try and expose this. I've given this information in 43 countries live and many more through books and films. And what's happened was that there's been a general understanding in most parts of the world that GMOs could lead to health dangers. About 51% of the US population as of several years ago, and 48% of the global population believe that GMOs could lead to side effects. So the biotech industry countered by pretending that the new GMOs created by gene editing are somehow different. They claimed, as they did with their original GMOs, that there was a precise technology that had no safety concerns and that it was all natural. On that basis, they convinced many governments, including the United States and Canada, the UK, Australia, Japan, Argentina, Brazil, in India. They convinced them that gene editing was safe and predictable, and therefore no safety studies and no labeling was needed. And they're trying to get the EU to do the same. There's a big fight now in terms of the EU, and they're very close to winning that war as well.
Well,
Now,
it's time for us to take yet another station break. Jeffrey and I will be right back to continue our discussion. Please stay right there. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. Are we in more danger than we think? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. With us discussing the health risks of GMOs and glyphosates is Jeffery M. Smith. His website, responsibletechnology.com. Jeffrey, anybody that's been around and watched spray planes, okay, then you have a field on one side of what they're trying to spray, and then there's a little road, and on the other side we have another farmer's field. Maybe he's trying to be organic. Then the wind kicks up. Okay. So even though somebody's, even certified organic, are we still getting that stuff in our food?
It's interesting that even though organic doesn't allow GMOs or Roundup, you still get some kind of drift. There's contamination for many reasons. Sometimes it's natural, sometimes it's human error. Sometimes it's just transporting grain in a transport system that previously handled GMOs. Back when I worked at a GMO detection laboratory as the vice president of marketing in the year 2000, we found that the non-GMO corn, even at that early stage of the game, about 1% was contaminated with at least a small percentage of GMO corn. And soy, there's also soy that's contaminated, etc. Canola can contaminate through cross-pollination the whole brassica family. So it's not just contaminating other canola, it can contaminate the broccoli and the Brussels sprouts, etc. Now, that's with the GMOs. You also have the glyphosate, which gets carried in the air. There was a study done by the U.S. Geological Survey that found 60 to 100% of air samples and rain samples contained glyphosate. In Mississippi, another study found 75% on average. There are some organic farms that cannot grow their products 100% glyphosate free because it's in the rain. And so you will find a very small percentage of glyphosate even in organic wine, but the regular wine, they use Roundup and glyphosate-based herbicides to spray between the rows. It gets absorbed into the roots and then into the grapes. And so you'll find a much higher percentage. If you go to responsibletechnology.org, we have a database of research that's been done on glyphosate residue levels in food, both generic food by the type of vegetable or fruit or grain or bean, as well as in some cases, the brand names of finished products. So at responsibletechnology.org, you could see that oats, for example, which are not genetically engineered, have a high level of glyphosate. Why is that? Because it is sprayed on oat fields just before harvest to dry down the crop, to force fast ripening, and to kill the weeds for next year. This is also done with wheat. It's also done with legumes. So beans like mung beans and lentil beans also have high levels of glyphosate. I wouldn't eat garbanzo beans or hummus unless it's organic. The organic may have a little, but it's a fraction compared to the amount that's found in the non-organic varieties, especially those in northern climates, for example, like the wheat in Canada has been sprayed with glyphosate to speed up the ripening process because it has a shorter growing season. But that, of course, gets sold in the United States as well.
Naturally. So, what's the molecular size of, say, for instance, the glyphosates? Is it something that we can filter out of our water, or is it too small?
It's difficult to filter out, but I have identified certain filters that work. Whenever someone wants me to evaluate something for possibly sharing with my organization of people, my community at responsibletechnology.org, I require them to show me the test so that there's no detectable level of glyphosate. It's quite tiny. In fact, my friend Stephanie Seneff points out that the molecular size is very similar to glycine with an extra tail, and that she believes that it's being used as a glycine substitute in the building up of proteins. And if that's true, its influence could be far more devastating than people realize. So it's quite small, and it's because it's sprayed 300 million acres, 300 million pounds in the United States per year, and it's in the air and the water. It's practically ubiquitous. So in my film Secret Ingredients that I did with Amy Hart, there are some doctors that say you can't expect to be 100% free of glyphosate contamination, but you can expect to dramatically reduce your exposure. And they're finding, unfortunately, small exposures can still have effects. A tiny exposure to rats cause non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is now being suffered. About 25 to 30% of the US population have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And I believe that glyphosate exposure in food and water and air is a primary driver of that.
So, what's the half life on this stuff? I mean, does it eventually go away, or does it hang around forever?
Well, Monsanto had claimed that Roundup was biodegradable and got sued and lost because they had to take the word biodegradable off of their product, and then they continued to call it biodegradable in another country until they got sued and lost there. The longest recorded half-life, meaning how long it takes to degrade to 50% of the volume, was 20 years in one study, but it's usually quite less. It can be a year and a half, etc. Depends on the amount of natural occurring enzymes in the soil, the amount of biological activity in the soil, the pH, the clay content. It varies. Because it's a chelator and grabs onto minerals, it can also become dormant by grabbing onto certain minerals in the soil. And then by spraying certain fertilizers, it can uncouple and then become active again, damaging crops and also human and animal health.
I understand that the soil is alive, or ideally, okay. So, if all this glyphosate is sinking into the soil, what impact is it having on the quality of our soil and, ergo, the quality of our food?
Glyphosate was patented as an antibiotic. So when we take it in our own gut, it kills the beneficial bacteria, lactobacillus, bifidus, etc., but doesn't kill the nasty stuff, the stuff that produces salmonella, the botulism, etc. Now, it's a similar thing in the soil. When it gets sprayed in the soil, it kills the beneficial bacteria, and it provides a kind of a perfect growth for fungal disease. Dr. Huber, who was a professor emeritus at Purdue University and an expert at glyphosate, told me that there are 60 fungal-based diseases for plants that have been skyrocketing in the United States because of the overuse of glyphosate. It kills not only the bacteria that prevent fungal growth, it actually feeds fungus. Fungus will eat glyphosate for breakfast and grow. So there's an expansion of fungus, there's a reduction in the beneficial bacteria, and some of that bacteria in the soil that's dying had actually formed the structure of the soil to allow water absorption. So this compactifies the soil. If you look at Roundup Ready soy and corn fields next to each other after a rain, the Roundup Ready versions next to the non-Roundup, the Roundup Ready versions have pools of water, whereas the non-Roundup Ready crops have absorbed the water. So it turns out that the proliferation of Roundup Ready crops in over 90% of the soy and corn fields in the United States is also promoting runoff and flooding. And it runs it off with the glyphosate that gets brought into the water, which can potentially damage the marine life. There's
And
also
what's happening to the topsoil with all that runoff?
Well, certainly the topsoil is in a dangerous situation. Some people say that we have only 55 seasons of growing left before we lose all of our topsoil. And glyphosate is part of the problem in that.
It sounds like we're trying to turn the entire planet into one big desert if we keep this up. If we were to manage to miraculously stop the production of this stuff and the distribution of it, how long would it take, or would it ever recover? Would we ever recover from this?
Well, it's an interesting thing. Chemicals can be broken down. They have half-lives. There are certain enzymes that you can take internally and put into soil to break down glyphosate more quickly. Unfortunately, you have some longevity in other reasons, in other areas. I interviewed a Dr. Skinner from University of Washington who had injected glyphosate or Roundup into pregnant rats and found that the grandchildren, and most especially the great-grandchildren of those pregnant rats, had serious problems. And that's because there was an epigenetic effect, a change not in the genes, but in the mechanisms that govern gene expression. He even found these changes in the sperm of the male rats, so he could show the mechanism by which this epigenetic effect was passed down. So this wide exposure of glyphosate in this generation could affect future generations through epigenetic effects. He also said that this generation was suffering from epigenetic effects probably of DDT, which also passed down effects to future generations. He mentioned obesity. In addition, with GMOs, because they self-propagate, it's not like the chemical spill that will go away over time. There was a potentially allergenic corn called Starlink, which was discovered by the laboratory that I worked in 2000. And it was found in Kraft taco shells. So it was recalled, but not only that, 315 other products had to be recalled because the USDA found Starlink corn, which had only been planted to about 1% of the acres of the United States. It was found in about 80% of all samples, even in very, very fine levels. It was a $2 billion problem. U.S. trade markets closed their doors to this potentially dangerous corn. We were no longer able to trade to China, Europe, etc. There was a massive effort to clean up Starlink from the corn supply. It was still found in a small percentage 3 years later because you can't clean up the gene pool 100%. So we may have genetically engineered corn and soy, etc., in our environment, in our food supply, in 10,000 years, even if we banned GMOs today. The amount would be much, much smaller because we wouldn't be adding to the gene pool every year with millions of acres of this stuff. It would become less and less, but there's no way to eradicate it with today's technology.
Goodness. Well, I hope technology advances quickly because it looks like we're in a whole bunch of trouble, aren't we?
Especially with genetically engineered microorganisms.
Well, it's time for us to take yet another station break. Please stay with us as Jeffrey and I continue our discussion. This is Mission Evolution, www.missionevolution.org. Is resistance futile? This is Mission Evolution, missionevolution.org. We're continuing our discussion with Jeffery M. Smith. His website, responsibletechnology.org. Jeffrey, if this continues unchecked, what can we expect to see with the health of humans and animals in, say, 10, 15 years?
I'm afraid it doesn't look great because with the deregulation of gene editing around the world and the gene rush that's going on by individuals and companies to get their GMOs onto the market quickly and to get them out before the patent expires, everything is basically up for grabs. Anything with DNA, anything can be gene edited and sold as food or given away or released in most of these countries, and depending on the type of gene editing. And that means that we've basically given the keys to the kingdoms to virtually anyone. Right now, in high school classes, many of these science classes have CRISPR labs, and they're very inexpensive. You can get your own for less than $2,000. And you could imagine that pretty soon they'll be equipped in all of the high school labs and here and in many countries around the world. And kids are being given assignments to gene edit bacteria now and other microorganisms. Here's where we have a particularly dangerous situation. Unlike other organisms, microorganisms swap genes readily. They go to big swap meets and say, here, try my gene. It may help you survive. Try my gene. Oh, thank you for that one. So imagine putting in a new gene that's never been part of the microbiome and having it now transmit and transfer to thousands of different species that were never originally receiving it in the lab. And they in turn can transmit it all over the planet. We don't know the impact. Some may cause disease. Some may collapse ecosystems. We talked about the importance of the microbiome for human health. It's absolutely life critical, but it's also life critical for the planet. The algae produce most of the Earth's oxygen. It's not the rainforests, it's the algae that's at the top of that oxygen chain. And the microorganisms in the soil are a large part of the Earth's carbon cycling. If they no longer pull in the carbon, then we change the whole equation. The mycorrhizal fungi underneath the trees shuttles nutrients to keep forests alive. Just like these micro Jedi army inside us has been basically outsourced for most of the biochemical functions in our bodies, they conduct the biochemical functions for ecosystems. We've only identified maybe 1% of the microbes on the planet and have identified what they do in terms of far less. And there's so much we don't understand, but we're kind of in awe at their role in life in general. At the same time, we're allowing companies to put genetically engineered microorganisms on tens of millions of acres right now, already out there. We're allowing high school students to create and release genetically engineered microorganisms. There's factories that use GM microorganisms that have been equipped with genes from various plants and others, or designed in factories to produce things like opioids or THC or CBD or industrial enzymes and chemicals. If the organisms were to escape into the environment, maybe take up residence in our guts, maybe influence our food supply or the food supply of the animals, it could be a disaster. So I think that the single greatest existential threat that we're facing is likely the unregulated, widespread genetic engineering of microorganisms, which is growing over time, which is why at responsibletechnology.org, you'll see that it's the priority of our Institute for Responsible Technology. And you'll find a 16-minute film called Don't Let the Gene Out of the Bottle, which describes this much better than I can.
So let me see if this is correct. Are viruses microorganisms? Are they um, susceptible to this? And if so, are we looking at another pandemic?
Well, yes, viruses are one of the microorganisms. Some people describe them as unliving. Some people said they still carry the definition of microorganisms. And there's been an effort to identify and try to stop the gain of function research, which is believed by many to be the backbone of the COVID pandemic. Whether it was or wasn't, we do know that there are laboratories that take viruses and enhance their ability to infect and enhance their ability to cause greater damage in the infection and to enhance the ability to infect a wider variety of species. So this is called gain of function, and there's been an effort to ban the gain of function on potentially pandemic pathogens. Now, I am all in favor of this ban, but there's one thing that they're not taking into consideration, and that's biology, and that it's not just the pathogens that can make us unhealthy. The healthy bacteria in us, the microbiome that's in our bodies, soil, air, water, if that gets corrupted, then we may lose these functions that can devastate human health, collapse ecosystems, etc. So I think the gain of function banning movement, which I'm in favor of, needs to open the aperture and realize we could lose the entire ecosystem, internal and external, by allowing what seems to be benign work, but can turn out and through gene spreading and not knowing how this thing works, come back to bite us in ways that we've never seen before in the history of civilization or nature.
About how long would we be looking at before this became an issue?
You know, it's completely difficult to say. When you release genetically engineered microbes, then most of them will die. They're not designed to survive, but some will survive. And some companies, the ones that are releasing it for agriculture, design their microbes to survive. Now, I remember talking to a microbiologist, and at the beginning of the hour-long conversation, he wasn't concerned about the release of genetically engineered microbes. He said, oh yeah, they'll just simply be overwhelmed by the evolution and die off. And then I explained how many different varieties are being created in academia alone. And then I described the agricultural microbes that are designed to survive. And then by the end of the conversation, he was totally on board and said, you're right, no genetically engineered microbes should be released. I talked to one microbiologist and I said, give me an example of something that can transfer from soil to humans. And he said, when you release a genetically engineered microbe in the soil, you want it to survive and outcompete the competition. So you equip it with antimicrobial genes that will kill off its competitors, and antibiotic resistance so it won't be killed off by them. Irrespective of what trait you put into the soil, that antimicrobial and antibiotic resistance, that might transfer into some simple organism inside our gut that has been maintaining the proper balance. And now it's equipped with an ability to live long and prosper, killing off other bacteria, being unkilled by antibiotics. And now you've completely changed the structure of the microbiome. You've changed the balance, which can lead to disease. So that can happen very quickly. How long it would take to release in the environment? Well, I'll tell you, if you go to Don't Let the Gene Out of the Bottle, you'll hear Dr. Elaine Ingham describe a study that she was aware of, which had it gone through, and they were about 2 weeks away from releasing it, she said the outcome could theoretically end terrestrial plant life on planet Earth. and by turning all of the roots to alcohol. You'll see it in the film, Don't Let the Gene Out of the Bottle.
I understand that the GMO 2.0, gene editing and genetically engineered microbes, are in the works. What are we looking at there?
Well, it's happening now all over. We have the synthetic biology laboratories. We have people creating genes and organisms from scratch, and it's now being combined with AI. So you can tell an AI, please create an organism that does this or this, or please change a plant so that it does this or this. Unfortunately, we've never really cracked the code on the DNA, and the most common result of genetic engineering is surprise side effects. So when you hand AI, which is also prone to side effects and AI dreams and nightmares, and you combine it with robots that are creating new genetically engineered sequences, either in microorganisms or plants, it's a recipe for potential disaster. We also have a technology that can spread a trait to all of their offspring. So normally when you combine a genetically engineered crop with a non-GMO crop, only half the offspring get it. But there's a technology that can spread it to all offspring because it transfers the genetic instruments to the offspring and causes the gene to show up on both sides of the chromosome. So this means that we can wipe out certain species or change the traits of entire species at the whims of certain companies. So we really are equipping and that's called gene drives. We are equipping humans who have very little understanding of the outcome with a technology whose outcome can outlast humanity.
That's scary. Well, we're close to the end of the show, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, Jeffrey, what's your mission?
Well, my mission is to protect the genetic integrity of humanity and all living beings, as well as the food supply, and to help uplift humanity in ways that can then actually reorganize our civilization so it operates more in tune with natural law. And so I've been working on the stopping of GMOs for nearly 30 years, and now I'm working on technologies to uplift human consciousness, etc. And we'll have that discussion probably early next year when my new book comes out.
We'll probably talk about it then. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Jeffrey, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me, Gwilda.
My pleasure. Our guest this hour has been Jeffery M. Smith, the founder and executive director of IRT and the author of Seeds of Deception.